So let's have a look at predominant chords, and this is where some students tend to get a little bit apprehensive in the harmony course. It's something that they may never have come across before, but it's quite simple once you get into it, once you get used to it, what predominant chords are and how we use them. Predominants are, as the name suggests, chords that come before the dominant at cadences. Okay, so some theory books actually include predominance as part of a cadence. So instead of just an authentic cadence be 5-1, some books will actually say that you can include a couple of predominants in there. So like chord 1-5-1 or 2-5-1 or 4-5-1. As long as it ends on a 5-1, that's what makes it an authentic cadence. So predominance, you can think of predominance as almost part of your cadential material. Okay, the cadence itself, the cadence proper, is always the last two chords, but predominants are sort of just shoved in there to connect the cadence with the rest of the music, the pre-cadential material. Okay, so it's just a way of leading into cadences, I suppose. The simplest way to expand authentic cadences is to introduce the tonic chord again as a predominant. So in other words, in major keys, that would be chord 1-5-1, or your tonic, dominant, tonic. And in minor keys, just watch out that obviously your tonic now is lowercase when you're analysing it because it's a minor chord. So again, tonic, dominant, tonic. And just to show you what that looks like, I'm now in the key of B flat major. Just got a little bit tired of going through C major all the time, so I've just changed the key to B flat major just for variety. So you can see there that both examples have authentic cadences, and both of them are in major. And in fact, the only difference between one and the other is you can see that in the second example I've used a dominant seventh chord instead of just a dominant chord. And notice that the voices are quite tight together. There's conjunct motion between most of them. You can see actually that the only real difference is in that dominant seventh chord, the tenor part has an E flat, whereas in the first example it just has an F. Now people will say, well, what about the golden rule about keeping the same voice part, or keeping the same note to the same voice part? You can see here that in the first example your tonic chord is for the tenor part has an F, and then for the dominant chord, the next chord, the tenor part again has that F. So yes, it does follow that rule about the golden rule about keeping the same voice part. The second example, people say that E flat ruins the golden rule. It doesn't really, because you can see that the voice line is moving down between an F and the tonic chord to a D in the final tonic chord. In that tenor part, you can see that it's moving downwards, F, E flat to D. And that's very satisfying for the ear to listen to. It sounds logical. It's like a logical movement for the ear to hear, because the seventh wants to fall again. So all I've done there really is introduce a much richer sounding chord, that dominant seventh chord. And although it means that now the tenor part can no longer stay in that F, it's got to move down to an E flat, it still sounds good, because then it follows the rules that we've already looked at, that sevenths need to fall. Okay, so the E flat falling down to the D. So that second example is actually better. Okay, even though all the voice parts have to move, whereas in the first example it was only the soprano and alto really that had to move. In this it's better, that I think, because you actually get a richer sounding chord and you're using all the rules from before. So that's the first example. You can see that it gives that 3-2-1 motion in the soprano line. Da da dum. But it means the leading note of the key needs to be resolved from the alto to the soprano part. So remember, leading notes need to rise. Well, here you can see that the leading note is not rising. The alto is not rising up to that B flat. It's actually falling down to an F. This is one of the few exceptions to the rule that leading notes need to rise. The ear is actually tricked into thinking that the alto line has risen, has gone up to that B flat, but in fact it's the soprano line that's come down to the rescue. So suppose a more accurate way to describe the movement of leading notes is that it's got to sound as if the leading note is moving up to the tonic. Even though in this example you can see that the A is falling down to the F, the soprano line comes to the rescue, so you need another voice part to come down to take over that sound that would otherwise be missing. We've already looked at that briefly in other lessons, but you can see how it's applied here in both the authentic cadence without this dominant seventh and in the authentic cadence with the dominant seventh. Okay, so the second example, the authentic cadence with the dominant seventh, you can see as well how that E flat is falling down to the D. So that movement in that entire line, that tenor line, F falling to E flat, falling down to D, that sounds very, very good. Okay, even though it doesn't have the same effect in the previous example where you had just two Fs, that's equally good as well. But if you want a richer sounding chord, this is the one to use. E flat falling down to your D, the dominant seventh chord moving to your tonic chord. And let's hear how that sounds. So I hope you're able to hear that. Da-dum, that's seventh falling down to the next note. Okay, so remember, sevenths fall, leading notes rise, but sometimes when the leading notes rise, it's a different voice part that comes to the rescue to fill out that note. Okay, so it needs to sound as if the leading note is rising. So basically that's the easiest way to expand an authentic cadence is just to introduce a tonic chord that comes before it. And again, you can either just keep it as a 1-5-1 chord or progression, or you can make it a wee bit more adventurous and have a 1-5-7-1 chord, and that I think sounds better. Okay, so let's have a look now at other predominants besides the tonic chord. The supertonic chord can also be used as a predominant with the tonic. Okay, so instead of just having 1-5-1 or 1-5-7-1, you can actually have 1-2-5-1. Okay, so you've just expanded the chord progression even further. We're still in the key of B flat major here, by the way, so you still have the same sort of movement as before, but you can see I've introduced a new chord. I've got a chord 2 in there between chord 1 and chord 5. So that's just another way of expanding your cadence again. And chord 2 is very, very common before chord 5. If you're able to remember the circle of fifths from the previous lessons, the last four chords in that circle of fifths were 6-2-5-1. So you can see that 6-2 would be a good progression in here, and then followed by 5-1. So 2-5-1, that chord progression 2-5-1, or here as we have it 2-5-7-1, 2 to the dominant seventh to chord 1. That's very, very common in any style of music, not just classical. You get that in a lot of pop music as well as rock music and folk music as well. I play it all the time when I'm accompanying Irish traditional music, the 2-5-1. So it's very common chord progression, 2-5-1. So chord 2 then is probably, for me anyway, it's actually the most frequently used predominant chord that I play in music. And it leads to a strong 3-2-2-1 soprano part. Okay, so before it was just a 3-2-1 soprano line, but here you can see it's a 3-2-2-1. In other words, your third degree falling to the second degree, keeping to the second degree, falling to the first degree. But again, this means that the leading note of the key needs to be resolved from the alto to soprano part. Okay, so the soprano part needs to come down to the rescue to trick the ear into thinking that the leading note has risen up to the tonic. Cadences should be in root position, but predominance, especially the supertonic, can actually be inverted. So you can see here that chord 2, in the second example, I've made it a first inversion chord, in other words, a 2 with the 6 next to it. So again, if you're unfamiliar with the figured bass, I would recommend that you go back to the second lesson, I think, or even later, and go over those slides that deal with figured bass, because you are going to need to know them quite well for when you're doing chord progressions from now on. So yes, that 6 means it's a supertonic chord, but it's in first inversion. In other words, the third of the chord is at the bottom. So that's a C, E, G chord, but the E is at the bottom. It's on the bass line. The bass part has the E. Sorry, the E flat, I should say, actually. Yes, so the supertonic chord has the third at the bottom, and in this example it's E flat, that's at the bottom. And you can see that leads to a slightly smoother bass line, in that you're moving from E flat in chord 2 to your F in chord 5, okay, in your dominant chord. So yeah, the bass part only has to move up by a step. Whereas if you weren't doing that, you can see that there's a bit of a leap then between that chord 2 and the chord 5, but they're both equally good. The supertonic chord in first inversion is just more common. Okay, so supertonic chords are quite common predominant chords, and they're even more common when you in first inversion, when you put them into first inversion. So let's hear how that sounds. Okay, that was the first example, and now listen to the second example with the chord, supertonic chord in first inversion. So try and listen to the bass line. So the bass line was da 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 dum da da dum. So that E flat to the F is only moving up by step. Whereas in the first example it was da 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 da, bit of a leap, da da dum. Still okay, but it's better to have it, I think, in first inversion. Bum 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 bum. Okay, so that's the supertonic chord. Again, very common chord to be used as a predominant. In fact, nearly all the time with my students, when we're doing harmonizations for four voices, for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, 99% of the time, when the supertonic chord appears, it appears as a predominant. It appears just before chord 5, especially at cadences. So yeah, look out for that. See if you come across chord 2 quite frequently. And whatever music you're listening to, the chances are that you're definitely, in fact, going to come across a chord 5 to chord 1, no matter what tonal music you're listening to. And just look out from now on, see if you can find the chord 2 that comes before chord 5s, the predominant chord to all those chord 5s. So any piece of music that you have to hand, and there are loads that you can get on IMSLP or anywhere on the internet, see if you can find the authentic cadences, the chords 5 to chords 1, and then see what chord comes before that chord 5. And nearly all the time it's going to be a chord 2 or a chord 4 or something like that, a predominant chord. But the chord 2 is very common. So the first example was the supertonic chord just in root position. The second example was the supertonic chord in first inversion, which is more popular. And what is even more popular is the supertonic chord as a seventh chord. So remember that slide that we were looking at earlier about the dominant seventh and the supertonic seventh chord being the two seventh chords we're going to look at quite a lot in this course. Here's where your supertonic seventh chord comes into its own. It's quite common as a predominant chord. It's even better than just your chord 2 or chord 2 first inversion. And again, it's actually more common to have the supertonic seventh chord as a first inversion chord. In other words, 6-5. Okay, so that's, remember from the figured bass that 6-5 means first inversion seventh chord. So there's an extra rule that we have to take into account now. This is actually probably as difficult as your 4-part harmony is going to get. So all the rules that we looked at so far, this is probably the next one that you have to make a note of. So far the rules that we've looked at, besides things like checking for consecutive perfect fifths and octaves and making sure the voice parts don't cross and keeping conjunct motion and making sure your spacing's okay, those are all general rules. But the real sort of nitty gritty, the real detailed rules that you need to know, the leading note should rise, the seventh should fall, and this is the next one. The seventh of the supertonic chord, which is also the tonic note of the key, I'll come back to that in a second, it needs to be prepared in the same voice in the previous chord. So it's quite a difficult rule to remember, but I'm just going to go through it and break it down for you one part at a time. Therefore, in a major key, your tonic chord to your supertonic seventh chord in first inversion is a good predominant progression because the seventh, the tonic note of the key, is already present in chord 1. So just to break this down, let's have a look at the second chord there, that 2-6-5 chord, that supertonic 7th chord first inversion. You're in the key of B flat major, so your supertonic chord is going to be a C E G chord, or if you want to get more pedantic, a C E flat G chord. And your 7th on top of that is your B flat. The 7th on top of that chord is a B flat. So that B flat is the tonic note of the key, because you're in the key of B flat major. So the 7th of chord 2, 7th of your supertonic chord, is the tonic note of the key. Okay, so your supertonic chord, your 2-7 chord, if you form your triad first in key of B flat major, it's C, E flat, G. Add your 7th on top of that, C, E flat, G, B flat, and then you can see that that B flat is actually your tonic chord, or sorry, your tonic note. It's the tonic note, it's the key note. You're in the key of B flat major. So your 7th of chord 2-7 is the tonic note of the key. And it needs to be prepared in the same voice in the previous chord. You can see there the blue. I've circled the 7th in chord 2-7, and you can see that it's been prepared, it's been anticipated in the same voice part in the previous chord. And that is where that second bullet point comes in. Therefore, in a major key, chord 1 to chord 2-6-5 is a good predominant progression because you need to prepare that 7th. In chord 2-7, that 7th needs to be prepared. The most logical chord to put before it is another chord that has B flat in it, and if you're in the key of B flat major, the most obvious one is going to be your tonic chord, B D F, B flat D F. So hopefully you're able to see that. I apologize if I've gone through it quite quickly, but play this part of the video over and over again because it is something you need to be familiar with and get comfortable with, that whenever you're using a supertonic 7th chord, that 7th needs to be prepared in the same voice in the previous chord. So you can see that B flat has been prepared, and because it's a 7th, you can see that it's falling. See the blue arrow showing you the direction that that B flat is going. It's falling down to an A in the next chord, in your dominant chord. And then to finish off, there is your leading note rising, or at least the soprano comes to the rescue to make you think the leading note is rising, but you have to be able to hear that rising leading note, so that A needs to sound like as if it's moving up to B flat. So all the rules are being followed here. You have your authentic cadence, you have your leading note rising, you have the 7th of chord 2-7 falling, and you have the 7th of chord 2-7 being prepared in the previous chord. So 1, 2-7, 5, 1, and the 2-7 is a first inversion chord, in other words 2-6-5. That's a very common chord progression, not just in classical music but in any music. Now you may have the voice part slightly different to this when you start doing your exercises. You mightn't have the 3-2-2-1 exactly where you can see it up there in the soprano line, but I'm just showing you my example of it just to show you how the rules should be applied, how to follow the rules. So that's the new rule. The 7th of chord 2-7 needs to be prepared. So the other rules, the other ones that we looked at in this lesson, the leading note needs to rise. Okay, we've seen that from authentic cadences and deceptive cadences. The 7th needs to fall. We've seen that in authentic cadences as well, where the dominant 7th chord go into chord 1, your tonic chord. The 7th of that dominant 7th chord needs to fall. That is also applied for supertonic 7th chords. You can see it here. The supertonic 7th is falling. And then the final rule, the third rule, the 7th of chord 2-7 needs to be prepared. You don't have to use chord 1 come before the chord 2-7 to prepare that 7th, but I find it's the most logical one to use. We've already seen how the tonic chord is a good predominant. In other words, a chord progression that goes tonic to dominant to tonic. So it's already logical to include it in this chord progression because it's a good predominant anyway. And not only that, it also helps prepare the 7th if you're going to use a supertonic 7th chord. So yeah, it's all bases are covered basically. So let's hear how that sounds. And just to finish up on supertonic, the supertonic 7th chord is a predominant. It can also be used as a predominant to a dominant 7th chord. So you can see I've just included a little extra thing on that dominant 7th chord. You can see how the F is still there in the tenor line. So you have an F A C chord and the F is still there. And I've just put the 7th coming in as a quaver right after that F. So and then that 7th is falling down to the D in the tenor part. So I didn't have to do that. I could have just left the E flat as a crotchet on that dominant 7th chord, but I've just put it in as a quaver, just so you can see how the tenor line can fall step by step. It's quite satisfactory. It's quite satisfying for the ear to listen to that. So if you look at the supertonic 7th chord, you've got a G in the tenor line, and then the dominant 7th chord, that the G has fallen to an F and then to an E flat, and then on the tonic chord, the final chord in the tenor part, the E flat has fallen down to a D. So you have that descending, almost like a wee scale passage, just falling from G all the way down to D. And that sounds good to the ear because it sounds as if the chords are progressing naturally, you know, that you're falling by step each time. So let's have a look to see if all the rules are how all the rules are applied in this example. So first of all, the supertonic, the chord is in first inversion. Okay, so it's good to have it as a first inversion chord or as a first inversion 7th chord. The 7th has been prepared in the previous voice part, on the same voice part I should say, in the previous chord. The leading note of the key rises, albeit to another voice. As I said, the soprano has come down to the rescue to fill out that tone. The 7ths of the supertonic and the dominant chords both fall, so you can see how the 7th in the dominant 7th, the E flat falls to the D, and the 7th in the supertonic 7th chord, the B flat falls down to the A. And also just to circle that wee point that I've already gone over, I suppose, but it's just a new thing. The 8th, or I should say the 8th, creates a smoother tenor line from chord 2 to chord 5 to chord 1. Okay, so as you can see, it's just that tenor line is a lot more smooth now. It's moving down by step from the G down to the D. G, F, E flat, D. Okay, so that's all the rules that we've more or less looked at in this entire lesson so far. We've got our authentic cadences there. We've made sure that the leading note is rising. We're making sure that our 7ths are falling. We're making sure that our 7th in the supertonic 7th chord is prepared. And then just the wee extra thing here, you don't have to do this, but it just sounds nice. Having the 8th degree just before your 7th comes in. So you don't have to have your 7th coming in with the chord. It's quite common actually to play your chord and then have the 7th coming in just as a wee afterthought quite quickly before the next chord. Okay. So just to hear how that sounds. So hopefully you were able to hear that da da dum in the tenor line. And probably the next most common and the last predominant that we're going to look at is the subdominant chord. Again, the subdominant chord is a very common predominant chord as well. So if you're using an authentic cadence from chord 5 to chord 1, you can introduce that authentic cadence with a chord 1 before your dominant as a predominant chord, or your chord 2 as a predominant chord, or now as we'll look at your chord 4. So chords 1, 2 and 4 basically are your best predominant chords. You can also use a chord 6, but I think chord 1, 2 and 4 are by far the best. So again, we're in B flat major, and you can see now that I've introduced a chord 4 in red before your chord, or before your dominant chords, your predominant. So it's a predominant chord. And the second example there again, I've just taken that, little idea that we had in the previous slide about having the 7th coming in slightly later, not on the beat with the rest of the chord, just coming in as an afterthought. Usually sounds good because it stands out. I think if you have it coming in as a wee afterthought like that, because the ear can hear it clearly and then can hear it fall clearly. So it emphasizes that falling motion that 7th chords naturally have. So it's nice to have it coming in slightly later. So when you introduce your chord 4 as a predominant, this leads to a strong 3, 4, 2, 1 soprano part. So your 3rd degree to your 4th degree to your 2nd degree to your 1st degree in the soprano line. But again, this means that the leading note of the key needs to be resolved from the alto to the soprano part. And we've already seen this in previous examples, but just to go over it again, remember that leading notes need to rise, and if you don't want to have the alto part rising, in other words, you want to have that tonic chord to be a bit more thicker in texture, to have the F there, so you want the B, D and the F, you want your 5th of the chord. If you're going to do that, then you need your soprano line to come down to fill out that space in order for the ear to believe, at least to be tricked into believing, that the A has gone up to the B flat. And also, again, the 7th of the chord must fall as usual, and as we've already seen from the previous slide, the 8th creates a smoother tenor line from chord 4 this time to 5 to chord 1. Okay, so that's your chord 4 being used as a predominant there. Again, it just creates, you have to write it in such a way that it doesn't have any consecutive perfect fifths or octaves, and it also creates a nice smooth motion between each voice part. So no awkward wide leaps or wide spaces. So let's hear how that sounds. That was the first example. Da 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 dum in the soprano line. And here's the second example, and see if you can just spot that 7th that's just slightly delayed coming in, so you should be able to hear quite clearly and hear how it naturally falls. So it makes sense. It should sound natural when you hear it. So just look out for the 7th. So that da da dum da is the 7th. Da dum. It's falling to the 3rd in the next chord. So let's look at the submedian chord as a predominant, and it's usually used in collaboration with chord 2. And again, you can go back over this circle of fifths just to make sure that you understand the relationship between chords 2 and chord 6. So 6, 2, 5, 1 is very, very common. And remember, chord 2 is good in first inversion, and it's even better as a 7th chord in first inversion. So chord 6 to chord 2, 7, first inversion, to chord 5 to chord 1. It's very common progression. So that's what I've used here. Again, I just started with my tonic just to emphasize the key, which in this case is now G major, just to make it a wee bit different. And then you're moving to chord 6, and then to your chord 2, 6, 5, and then your chord 5, and then to your chord 1. So it leads to a very strong 3, 3, 2, 2, 1 soprano line. And again, you can see how the leading note rises, in inverted commas, to the G, your tonic. So leading note going up to the tonic. But of course, it's the soprano line coming down to the rescue this time, just to make sure that the ear hears that F sharp going up to the G. Again, the 7th of chord 2, 7 must be prepared, and this time we're in G major, so your chord 2, 7, your chord 2 in G major is A, C, E. Add the 7th on top of that, it's A, C, E, G, and the G is the tonic of the chord, so the G needs to be prepared, the G is the tonic of the key, and it needs to be prepared in the previous voice part, so you could have put a chord 1 in here, but I've put a chord 6 instead. Okay, so an E, G, B chord, because it has that G, which is the 3rd of the chord, and that prepares the 7th coming. You can see it's circled in blue in chord 6. That prepares the 7th coming in the supertonic 7th chord. So basically, when you're using a supertonic 7th chord, For our purposes, you're quite limited to the chords that you can have coming before it, because you need to prepare that seventh. So you need something, in this example, you need a chord that comes before that has a G, and not only that, but the G has to be in that same voice part. Okay, so it can be a chord 1, G, B, D. It can be a chord 6, E, G, B. And it can also be what other chord that has G? So it can be G, B, D, E, G, B, so chord 1, or chord 6, and C, E, G, which is chord 4. Okay, so chord 1, chord 6, and chord 4 will probably be the most common chords that come before any supertonic 7th chord. And let's hear how that sounds. And just to finish up for this lesson, we're going to look at predominance in minor keys. And it's basically just like the major keys. The most common predominance that we have in minor keys, again, are the tonic, the supertonic, and the subdominant chords. So it's exactly the same as the major keys, except with one difference. The tonic is now minor, obviously, and it's usually in root position, just like it was in major keys. The supertonic can either be diminished or in root position, or if you're using a supertonic 7th chord, it's usually half diminished, and it's usually in first inversion. Okay, so that's very common to have your supertonic 7th chord in first inversion, just like it was in major keys, except you've got to pay attention to what type of analysis you're going to use, what type of Roman numerals you're going to use. Okay, so it can either be an ordinary diminished chord, or a half diminished 7th chord. So remember that supertonic chords, it's very common to use supertonic chords as 7th chords, and if you do that in minor keys, you've actually changed the quality of the chord from a diminished chord to a half diminished chord. If you're unsure of the difference between diminished and half diminished chords, you can look over the previous lesson where we have gone into this in a wee bit of detail, actually, just about the differences between a fully diminished and a half diminished chord. And also the subdominant again, except now it's a minor chord, and it's still in root position. So you're still using the tonic, the supertonic, and the subdominant chords, but the quality of those chords are going to be different because you're in minor keys now. There's one extra thing you've got to remember when you're using predominance in minor keys. So it should be noted that in minor keys, if a predominant chord, and this usually occurs in the supertonic and the subdominant chords, if that predominant chord has the 6th degree of the scale, it should move by falling to the 5th degree of the scale found in the next chord, which is your chord 5, or your dominant chord. So this occurs mainly in predominant chords. Okay, so if you're using a predominant chord that has the 6th degree in it, that 6th degree's got to fall to the 5th degree in the dominant chord, and that is because you want to avoid any augmented intervals that would otherwise occur. This is very important when you're using these chords, these predominant chords, when you're writing for 4-part harmony for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. You should always remember that voices don't really like singing augmented intervals. They can do it, but it just doesn't sound as good, and it's quite difficult to do. So try to avoid augmented intervals in any voice part, and that's why you use the 6th degree falling to the 5th degree when you're using predominant chords in minor keys. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of that. So here you can see that we have 2 examples. We're using the tonic as a predominant chord, moving to the dominant, and then moving back to the tonic. So we still got to abide by all the same rules as before, but it should be obvious that the tonic chord in these examples is a minor chord, because you're in a minor key, obviously. But the same rules need to apply. So you can see that the leading note of the key must rise. So the leading note of the key must rise. Not only that, but the leading note itself is a raised note. As you can see, it's B natural in the key of C minor here. We've actually had to raise it. It's a raised seventh. And then because it's a raised seventh, it's your leading note, and it needs also to rise in that voice part. So the B in each example is rising up to the C. Note again that the seventh, for any seventh chords, that seventh must fall. So in the second example, we're using the dominant seventh, and that's a seventh occurs in the alto part. It's an F, and it's falling down to E flat. Okay, so same rules as before, basically. And let's hear how that sounds. Okay, that was the first example, and let's hear the second example with the seventh. So I hope you were able to hear that F falling to the E natural, that da-dum, and that's in the alto part, that seventh falling. Let's look at a few more examples of predominance in minor keys. So in this example, we're now using the supertonic as your predominant chord, and then as you can see that it's a diminished chord in the first example. It's got the wee circle symbol next to it, but in the second example, it's a seventh chord in first inversion. So that's why it's 2 with a 6/5 for your figured bass there, and you can see that the circle has now got a line through it to indicate that it's half diminished. So be careful of your analysis in minor keys. Remember that it's possible for each chord, except for the tonic chord, to have 2 different versions. You're usually going to be using the harmonic minor because we are dealing with harmony after all. But even then, when you're adding a seventh onto chords, you can end up changing the quality of the chord, and that's very common in the supertonic chord. But again, the same rules apply. You should be able to see that the leading note again in the key, the leading note rises in each example. Again, the first example, it's B natural. It's been a raised note and it's rising to C, and that's in the soprano part. And in the second example, I've just moved it to the tenor part, okay, just for a bit of variety. Again, the sevenths of the chords must fall. You can see that this occurs twice in the second example. The seventh of the supertonic chord, that's the C, and it's falling down to the B natural in the tenor part. And then you can also see that the dominant seventh is occurring in the alto part in the next chord, and it's falling down from an F down to an E, down to an E flat, sorry. And the other rule that we have to remember, because we're using the supertonic seventh chord, that seventh of the supertonic seventh chord must be prepared. So the chord that I put before it, again, probably the most common chord to come before it, would be your chord 1. So you can see there that the C in the tenor part has been prepared in the previous chord. And here's where we get to that part that I mentioned earlier about the new thing you've got to remember, and that is in minor keys, if the 6th degree of the scale occurs in a predominant chord, it must fall to the 5th degree of the scale. So you can see in both examples, in the supertonic chord, whether it's a supertonic chord or a supertonic 7th chord, doesn't matter, the 6th degree of the scale is there. We're in the key of C minor, so your 6th degree of the scale is in A flat. That A flat must fall down to the G. If it didn't fall down to the G, look at the first example there in the alto part. That's where you have the 6th degree of the scale on that supertonic chord at A flat. If the A flat didn't fall down to G, the A flat would then have to go to a different note of the dominant chord, and it could go to a B natural, but that means that's an augmented second interval. And if it went from A flat to D, that makes that an augmented 4th interval. So if it goes anywhere else, it's an augmented interval. So we must make sure that the 6th degree of the scale falls to the 5th degree of the scale if you're using it in a predominant chord. And let's hear how that sounds. Let's do the first example. And here's the second example. And again, I've just used the delay effect there in the second example, the seventh not really occurring on the chord. Its entry is delayed just by making the 8th degree fall to the 7th degree. Okay, and that occurs in the alto part. We've already looked at that in the major keys when we're using cadences in major keys. It's just a very effective, I think it's a very effective idea at cadences. It really makes that 7th stand out, and it really pulls the ear downwards to that E flat. So the ear is being pulled in two different directions. It's being pulled down from the F to the E flat, and as usual, the leading note, the B natural, going up to the C, the ear is being pulled upwards. So everything sounds nice and satisfying to the ear, that it's being taken where it's expected to go. You're being taken on a musical journey that you're expecting. These chords and these movements within the voice parts. So that's the new thing we've got to remember in predominance in minor keys. When we have that 6th degree in any predominant chord, here it's in the supertonic chord, if that 6th degree occurs in a chord that comes before your dominant chord, then it must fall to the 5th degree in the dominant chord. It's the only way to avoid those nasty augmented intervals. So let's look at one final example, and again we're going to look at, we've looked at the tonic chord, we've looked at the supertonic chord, and now we're going to look at the the subdominant chord as a predominant chord. So here it is in red. You can see where you're now using the subdominant as your predominant chord. It's very common. All the same rules must apply. In fact, this is probably it's going to sound very similar to what we've already heard. The leading note of the key must rise. I've just kept it in the tenor part this time. So you can see the leading note is still B natural, it's a raised note, and it's also your leading note, and it's also rising. So remember, leading notes must rise. Sevenths must fall. Again, I've introduced the 7th in the second example on the dominant chord, and I've just delayed, I've just delayed it coming in, so it comes in after all the other voice parts sound the rest of the chord. So the sevenths of 7th chords must fall. And again, because we have the 6th degree of the scale in the subdominant chord this time, that 6th degree still must fall to the 5th degree. Okay, and again, that avoids any nasty augmented seconds or augmented fourths between A flat and B natural or A flat and D. Okay, so let's hear how that sounds. And let's hear the second example, this time with a 7th. So you should be able to hear that 7th falling down to the E flat. And also look out again for the leading note rising from the B natural to the C. You can try also and listen out for that 6th degree falling down to the 5th. You need to have a very good ear to hear it. If that 6th degree went anywhere else, it'd probably be quite obvious that it was an augmented intervals, but it actually sounds, it's difficult to hear because it sounds correct. So if you are able to hear that A flat falling down to the G, then well done. But the main things that supposed to look out for is the 7th falling and the leading note rising. Those are the main rules that I want you to take away from today's lesson. So let's hear the last example. And that's it, guys. That's today's lesson. There was a lot in today's lesson. We looked at all the different types of cadences that we're going to be using in major keys and in minor keys. And then we looked at the chords that come before a dominant chord, your predominant chords in other words. And these were your chords 1, 4, and 2, or your tonic, subdominant, and supertonic. Okay, those are your most popular predominant chords. So the reason why we are starting at the end and working backwards is because when you're harmonizing, I always find it easier to do that, to actually start at your cadences and work backwards. So you start at, say, your authentic cadence, put in your 5-1, fill out your voice parts. Then you can use all the rules that we've looked at so far just to work your way backwards in the music. Okay, so figure out what your predominants are going to be, and then the fun part, this is what we're going to be looking at in the next lesson, is your pre-cadential material, what chords you use before your predominance. And when you've filled in all your pre-cadential material, that'll take you right back to the beginning of the phrase, and then usually in Bach chorales you have another cadence which comes before that, and then you keep working backwards. So you should really have a pattern in Bach chorales where you have an opening part which is your pre-cadential material, then your predominance, then your cadence, then your pre-cadential material and your predominance and your cadence, then your pre-cadential material, your predominance and cadence. So it's that's the structure basically that we're going to be looking at. And it's always best, I think, to start at the end and work backwards, because it makes it easier to check for all these rules we have to abide by. Leading notes must rise, sevenths must fall, avoid awkward augmented intervals, make sure the spacing's correct, make sure there's no overlaps, and also the most important thing from the other lesson that we looked at, avoiding consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. So I find that when I'm teaching students to start, if I'm teaching students to do this, and some of them prefer actually starting at the beginning of a Bach chorale and harmonizing from the very first beat to the very first bar and working their way forward, you'll find that a lot of the time they end up with a lot of consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. They forget to go back over and check it, or when they do go back over and check it, they find they have to rewrite so much of it because they've started at the beginning and worked their way forward. Whereas if you start at the end and work your way backwards, you tend to avoid a lot of these pitfalls. So again, if you need any extra help, if you have any questions or queries, or you want to meet up, arrange a time to meet up and go over this in a one-to-one or as a group, feel free to get in contact with me. Again, my contact details are through the website. So if you have any questions or anything, now is the time to let me know, because we are going to be moving on to the pre-cadential material in the next lesson, and I expect that you would know everything that we've looked at in this lesson, which was quite a lot. So please revise over your cadences, your predominance, both in minor keys and in major keys. Make sure that all your leading notes are rising. Your sevenths, if you're using them in your dominant chord or your supertonic chord, make sure that they fall. If you're using a supertonic seventh chord, make sure that seventh is prepared. And if you're using a predominant chord in a minor key that has the sixth degree of that minor scale, then that sixth degree must fall to the fifth. Okay, so there's quite a lot of rules in there. So again, if you need any help, please let me know. And I hope this has been of some use to you.